Hello everyone, sorry, the video started and I didn't realize. Welcome back. I'm Kris. This was a donated request by Mohamed Ismail. Yeah, I know it's not Ishmael because there's an H in that, I believe. Ismail, yeah. Used to be a Notre Dame college football player named Rahib Ismail, the Rocket. Rahib the Rocket Ismail. So that's, yep. If it's wrong, you got to change it for me so that I can't be wrong. That's how it works. Okay, this is his request. The printing press and the fall of Muslim Ummah. Ummah? Muslim, I almost said Ummah. Ummah. And the Muslim Ummah. It's my boy, it's Dr. Yasir. People don't know this. Dr. Yasir, he calls me all the time. He's just like, yeah, you're great. And other stuff, you know. It's not true, but let's just pretend it is. So, there's a thanks button on the channel. You can donate. You don't have to. All donations are appreciated. You can subscribe if you like any of my videos. If you've liked 1 second of one video, it's mandatory to subscribe. Click the bell. Warrior will cut toes off because of reasons. And yeah, if you don't want to do any of that, then just click the thumbs up. Clicking the thumbs down button guarantees you're going to get toe cancer. You know, nothing I can do about that. We're going to break this video down probably into 20-minute sections. How's that work? Does that work for you? We're going to do that. And video. And I got some apples and mushrooms. So don't mind me.
Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa wala amma ba'd. So today's lecture is a rather interesting one, and it is one that doesn't have any particular, if you like, general introduction to history. That's simply too much. It's entitled Lessons from History. And what I wanted to shed some light on is to answer the question that a lot of us had, and we've had references to this, of the rise and fall of the Islamic Ummah. The political rise and fall. Let's be very frank here, that our Ummah once upon a time was an intellectual powerhouse. It was at the cutting edge of civilization. It was admired and respected by the entire world. And this is a fact that nobody can deny, that never before in human history had a civilization basically been a global civilization from Andalusia to China, like the Muslim empire. And never before had we reached the peaks of scientific development, of literature, of arts, of calligraphy, as we had in the 10th, 11th, 12th, 13th centuries. Of course, now the whole situation is reversed. And we now are suffering economic crises. We are at the bottom of the development scale, the human, what is it called, the World Development Index, or the Human Development Index, that ranks the countries that are the most livable and the best. The top 50 countries, there's only 2 or 3 Muslim countries in the 40s and 50s. Right? The top 50 countries has 2 or 3, Kuwait and UAE, and the oil-rich countries, they're numbering in the 40s. In terms of livability and healthcare and education and all of this. So a question that we need to ask ourselves, what happened? Why? Why this reversal? And there's no doubt that this question cannot be answered in one lecture, much less a lecture of an evening. This is a question that has many dissertations, many PhDs, many volumes written. But what I wanted to do was to shed light on one particular aspect and to weave our way through 13 centuries to get a brief introduction of the change of mindset, of how Muslims were and then how they became, through the development of one technology, and that is the technology of paper and eventually the printing press. So just to shed some light about how Muslims were and how they evolved. And no doubt, before we even get to the issue of paper and how Muslims received it, before we even get to there, the question of why the Muslims rose and why they fell can be answered generically with 2 causes, spiritual and worldly. Very generically. They rose to the power that they were because of their iman and because they embraced the modern world and they embraced all that it had to offer. And then they fell because of their lack of iman and also because they failed to keep up with the times, right? In our times, we have two groups of intellectuals, usually the religious class on one side and the progressive class or the more academically inclined on the other, and they try to analyze the rise and fall only by one of these two. So usually when you hear the khatib on the minbar, he's going to say, he's going to quote you the verse, Allah does not change the situation of a people until they change themselves. All we have to do is to be better Muslims. And if we're better Muslims and we have more iman and taqwa and we come to the masjid, we will rise up again. I beg to differ and I say that's one of the two causes, right? On the other extreme, we have those who generally are not religiously inclined. Generally, they're not the ones emphasizing iman and taqwa and tahajjud and salah. And they're saying we rose because we led the Renaissance and we had the golden age and we discovered the sextant and the globe and the spheres and this and that, and we charted out the skies and we knew this and that. We mapped out the whole world and we discovered America. And so they have this entire intellectual history, right? And the golden age for them is that of Andalusia, where all the cultures mix, scientific achievements were at their zenith, and they say when the Muslims stopped this and they turned their back to civilization, the decline began. And for them, there's no question of iman and taqwa. It doesn't come on the equation. Spirituality has nothing to do with it, right? Now, I again beg to differ with them as well. And the easiest way to differ with them is to point out that the single most successful generation was that of the Sahaba. And the Sahaba conquered more land than any future generation. Yet they were technologically the least in terms of later generations. And they were civilizationally, they hadn't reached that pinnacle as Andalusia had reached. But because of their iman, and also I would add because of their willingness to engage with modernity of their time, with their willingness to adapt, they did manage to go where they went. So these are two generic causes, spirituality and deen and dunya basically, right? The world and your religion. I don't want to emphasize in today's lecture the religious side. I do that a lot in the khutbahs and I fully agree that that is the more important. And I fully agree that we need to emphasize our iman and taqwa before we jump to the sciences. I fully agree. I just wanted to point out that it is also true to say that the Muslims' inquisitiveness and the Muslims' embrace of the modernity of their time was an important factor. And eventually their shutting off of this door and their close-mindedness to change became a cause of their failure as well. And we're going to discuss this very briefly, inshaAllah ta'ala, very briefly in a nutshell, discussing the rise, the advent, the proliferation of paper, and then what the Muslims did with that, and then what the Muslims did with the second invention, and that is that of the printing press. So let us begin by talking about paper. What is paper? Paper is a substance without which we cannot imagine our lives. Paper is a substance that we write on, we print on. There is more paper printed today. It is said that if all the paper of the world were to be laid out flat, it would cover the whole world multiple times over. And there's more paper printed today after the age of the internet than before. A lot of people think that the internet is the demise of printing and paper. In fact, the opposite is true. That research has shown that there's more paper printed post-internet than pre-internet. And of course, paper is the single most useful material to write on, far more useful than anything that was used before paper. Paper was invented by the Chinese. It wasn't invented by the Muslims. Around 100 CE. And
the Muslims won a battle against the Chinese, and that was how they acquired paper, if I'm correct. I don't remember the battle, but I do remember that. They might not have fought the Chinese directly. No, I thought they did fight the Chinese. I wish I could remember that. I just remember. I kind of remember the battle, but I do remember that the Muslims won, and because of that, they got paper, and they were kind of the ones who brought paper. I'll say brought paper to the world, because China kept the paper to themselves. Not like they were doing it on purpose, but they used it, and it was their technology in a way. Am I right on that? But how they acquired it was from winning a battle or a war, or maybe several battles, something like that. I apologize for. You understand what I'm asking.
The Chinese only used it for very specific purposes. Apparently, it didn't click upon them the utility of paper. They used it primarily for fanciful artwork. They didn't use it for bureaucracy. It didn't become a staple usage of the Chinese empire. And so the Chinese kept it a trade secret. They didn't proliferate paper, and it was a guild. Whoever wanted to learn the art of paper making had to join this guild, and only if you were part of the guild would you be taught how to make paper. It didn't become a public knowledge. It was a private enterprise, and it remained this way for the next 300-400 years.
Yeah, it's like you'll hear it a lot. It's a proprietary blah blah blah. You can see it sometimes on if you buy something and you're reading the ingredients, and it might tell you it's this, and then a proprietary blend, and they'll tell you maybe what it is, but they won't tell you what the amounts. And that's because they're protecting, they're informing you, but they're protecting how they all put it together. So yeah, I could totally understand why they do that, especially if they knew just how special it was, which they had to have. Of course, maybe not. It's not like they traveled, the Chinese traveled the world after they came up with paper, and they were like, just go around the world and see who else has it. No one else has it. Good. It's a trade now. You got to be in this to know how to make it. They didn't do that, but yeah, it's going to be, you're going to hold on to that technology.
Of course, up until that time, the things that people used to write on were stones and rocks, were bones, were papyrus. Papyrus had been invented by the Egyptians, and papyrus was the most commonly used material in Mesopotamia. But in Arabia, when the Quran came down, papyrus was very difficult to get a hold of. When the Quran came down, the primary material that the Muslims used were leaves that came from the date palms, which they made a type of papyrus out of. Not as good as Egyptian, but they had some type of basic material of making this parchment of leaf. And they also used shoulder bones of camels. Camels have large shoulder bones. So they would write on this. They would also use the leather of camels. Now, what's the problem of using leather and things made out of leaves? Who can tell me?
Leaves, you could burn it, but if you wrote it on like a camel skin, wouldn't it fade? I'm trying to guess this out loud. It would fade over time. Let's see if I'm...
What's the problem with this? It's going to decompose very fast, number one. Number two, smell. Okay, I don't think they really were bothered about that. They used to live in houses made out of dung sometimes, right? They weren't really bothered about that. But what else? The volume, the size. And we have copies of the Quran written on leather. And you have pictures, you can Google it. I wanted to make a PowerPoint, but I didn't have time. I just got back yesterday, as you know. You can Google it. A copy of the Quran written in the first 50 years. It is, and I kid you not, almost as big as this table. That high, this high, and bigger than this table in width, and 3/4 of this table in length. This is a Quran that we have from around 60 or 70 Hijrah, an entire Quran in Egypt, and it is written on leather. Now, can you imagine every paper is a leather skin? How much is going to be there, right? So a Quran that big, this is not a personal copy.
That's going to be heavy too. Yeah, it's not a personal copy. That's something it's going to be at a designated area. That's going to be protected, super protected, I almost said. Yeah, just trying to move that thing and carry it, that's got to be heavy. I don't know exactly what books made of leather would be, but I got to assume it's heavy.
Abu Bakr wrote the Qur'ans, he wrote them on camel leather. And we can imagine that Qur'an would have been bigger than 2.5, 3 feet in width, lengthwise 4 or 5 feet, and widthwise as well. So this is massive Qur'an. This is what leather is going to do for the time. So this was what the Quran was written on. Because the earliest copies of the Quran were written on parchment and leather, hardly any copies of this period have come down to us because it decomposes. Very rare. We hardly have any copies of the Quran in its entirety from the first 50 years of the Hijrah. We have bits and pieces, parchments, fragments. We have the things here and there. But we hardly have a complete Quran. In fact, to be academically honest, we don't have a complete Quran that's written down in the first 60 years of the Hijrah. The first Quran is around 70, 80 that we have in our hands. Why? Because anything written on leather will decompose. Just like skin is going to decompose. So, paper is very different. Paper does not decompose. Another major importance of paper is that, generally speaking, paper absorbs ink far more permanently. Unlike leather. Leather, all they had to do when they wanted to reuse the leather was to put it in water for a few hours or a day, and then take it out and let it dry, and they could reuse the leather all over again. Right? And so one of the ways to destroy a book was to put it in water. Whereas in our times, paper, of course, the paper will ruin the water, but the ink will still be on there. Right? So paper also absorbs the ink better. Now, getting back to the topic at hand. When did the Muslims first come across paper? There was a small, insignificant battle between the Muslims and the Chinese forces in 751 CE. 751 CE, the early Abbasid period. And this battle is very insignificant politically. And it is hardly mentioned in the books of the time because it's a small battle, skirmish. But it changed the entire course of humanity afterwards because of the discovery of paper. The battle is known as the Battle of Tal'as in 751 CE. The Battle of Tal'as. And it took place in what is now Kyrgyzstan. And in this battle, the Muslims conquered a small area of the Han dynasty, and they took prisoners of war. And they discovered that 2 of the prisoners of war were from this guild of paper manufacturing society. 2 of the prisoners of war were from this secret guild, meaning that they wouldn't teach it publicly. You had to be a part of the guild. And of course, the Muslims had seen paper in China because people are using it. And now that they found out that these 2 prisoners were the people who knew how to make paper, they sent these prisoners of war under armed guard back to the Khilafah, back to Baghdad, right? Unlike the other prisoners that was ransomed off, sold, whatnot, these 2 prisoners are extra special. They have the VVIP treatment, right? They're sent back under armed guard to the capital. And there, the Sultan or the Khalifa finds out that these are paper manufacturers, so he says, instead of any ransom, instead of any money, you have to teach us the art of paper making and you shall be set free. We find here a willingness to acquire knowledge from non-Muslims and to then implement it. The Khalifa, just like the Prophet ﷺ before him a century ago, understood the importance of knowledge. Remember in the Battle of Badr when the Prophet ﷺ had prisoners of war who could read and write, what did he do? He said, instead of any money, I want every one of you to teach 10 of our kids how to read and write. Isn't this a well-known thing? In the Battle of Badr, he said, instead of any money, you guys, reading and writing was very rare. You guys, instead of any money, forget the money. We have something far more important than money. We have the knowledge of reading and writing. We want you to teach it to our kids. Teach 10 of our kids and you will be freed. And so the Prophet ﷺ did this. A century later, the Khalifa in Baghdad said the same thing. You have this knowledge, teach it to us and you shall be set free. And eventually, slowly but surely, paper then began to spread in Baghdad and then in Samarkand, and it began to supplant papyrus and other materials that was being used. And by the way, we hardly have any remains of ancient manuscripts in papyrus because papyrus erodes away. We have fragments of the Muwatta of Imam Malik and of the Sirah of Ibn Hisham written on papyrus pages here and there. In Paris, in London, we have certain fragments, but we don't have a single ancient book of papyrus because papyrus doesn't last. With the advent of paper, of course, all of this is about to change. And therefore, during the reign of Al-Mansur in 754 to 775, this was Al-Mansur, one of the early Abbasid Khalifas, Al-Mansur decreed that the entire bureaucracy, the dawaween, the registers, would change from papyrus to paper. We're now going to use paper for all government transactions and business dealings. All records are going to be on paper. Therefore, in around 770 or so, the entire Muslim lands began transcribing taxes and quotas and ratio, everything to do with the government. All government registrars, the dawaween of taxes and kharaj, the dawaween of zakah, the dawaween of lands, of governors, of correspondence, all of this changed into paper from papyrus. And therefore, the Muslims needed to manufacture their own paper, and for this purpose, the first paper manufacturing plant was set up first in Samarkand and then in Baghdad. The first paper manufacturing plant outside of China ever was taken and transformed by the Arabs in Baghdad and in Samarkand. And it is said that Harun al-Rashid was one of those who popularized paper. At that time, it was called Kaghad, from the Persian Kaghaz, which is Urdu to this day, Kaghaz. And this Persian word comes from the ancient Chinese word, which I don't know how to pronounce, but it's written as Kaghaz, so I don't know how to pronounce it. But there's a Chinese word that is this paper. So the word Kaghad, which is still Urdu, Kaghaz we call it to this day. And Arabs still, they know, classical Arabs, they know Kaghad is how they would pronounce a paper. It actually comes from Chinese. So this shows us that the influence that the Chinese had on Muslims. Later on, we're going to see an Arabic word that came into English. We'll get there. But just by words, we have an indication of where ideas came from. The word for paper is in fact Chinese. And that is kaghad. Now the Muslims understood the significance of paper. And paper revolutionized knowledge completely. And one of the few people who pointed this out was Ibn Khaldun. Ibn Khaldun is the first social historian. He's the first person to analyze the rise and fall of nations from a sociological perspective. And he is known as the father of sociology even in Western worlds. Ibn Khaldun wrote, this is many hundreds of years later, thus, during the reign of Harun al-Rashid and before him al-Mansur, thus, paper was introduced for government documents and diplomas. Afterwards, people used sheets of paper for scholarly writings. And paper and the manufacture of paper reached a considerable degree of excellence. So people understood. Now, what is paper? Paper is an engine for social change, for intellectual change, for artistic change. The presence of paper signifies what? Literacy. It signifies education. It signifies, therefore, what does education signify? Productivity, intellectual genius, scientific inquiry, Islamic scholarship. All of this is synonymous with paper. And therefore, when Muslims embraced paper, the Islamic revolution of thoughts and ideas sparked off. And they began doing many things, Islamic scholarship, writing books, translating the books of the ancient Greeks. And this led to, as we all know, the initial Islamic renaissance, if you like, the Islamic flourishing of sciences. And as a footnote,
it had to have been weird to have had an idea, you write it down, and then parchment or leather, whatever, it accidentally gets erased. And you were like, oh man, what was that? I don't know. It was a cake recipe for all I know. I don't know. And you didn't have it anymore. And you hadn't memorized it or anything like that. And now you got paper, and it almost seems difficult for the ink to come off of the paper. And now you're thinking, oh my goodness, I can write anything. I can write down anything. And it's always going to be there. Just the idea that it's really, minus a fire, it's really going to stay. Like there had to have been such a relief. Because, as you say, the leather, soak it in water. I just figured it would fade over time. I thought maybe something with the skin it would dry up or something. But, I have no idea. But yeah, it's got to be so weird to know that this is going to last longer, and you could save it better. Oh, that had to be awesome.
It's interesting that there were many types of paper at the time, depending on the people who invented them and the people who patronized them. We had Sulaimani paper, we had Ahmadi paper, we had Nurani paper, right? All of these are different types of papers. Depending on what paper you wanted, these were all Islamic names. A very interesting point, many people don't know this. When Muslims acquired paper, the art of making paper, they did two things. Firstly, They developed a new process from the Chinese processes. And I already said they had their own types of paper. Nurani and Ja'fari. There's a Ja'fari paper, I'm not inventing this. There's a Ja'fari paper named after Ja'far, the guy who invented it. And there's different types of paper. Now, they took the technology that the Chinese gave them, and they took paper making to a whole new level. And they made paper, basically proliferated it throughout the entire Islamic lands. The Chinese hadn't done that. The manufacturing was still very primitive, and it was secretive and elitist. The Muslims made it popular in an entire region. That's the first thing they did. The second thing they did, very interesting here, the Chinese and everybody before them, anytime they had papyrus, what do you do with papyrus? How do you store it? Tell me, what do you do when you have a papyrus? You write a long thing, what do you do then? Exactly, you roll it up, right? And this was what the Chinese would do with their ancient papers as well, because papyrus automatically rolls up. So they would just roll it up and put it in a box or something. Now paper doesn't roll. So Muslims are now producing a lot of paper, writing books. Therefore the Muslims began stacking sheets of paper together. And they decided to start binding from the side. Never before had paper been bound from the side. And they would sew together what they called, jumping the gun here, what do you call a whole stack of papers? A stack of papers is called?
A book.
A ream. A ream of papers. The word ream comes from the Arabic word. An Arabic word that means bundle. A ream of papers, it comes from, the Arabic word is rizma. So they dropped the zeen, and so they made it a ream. The word ream comes from rizma. So they started putting papers stacked together.
We're going to go ahead and stop it there. We'll go back just before he gets back into it. Yeah, what do you call paper stacked together? Book. No. That's after it's been bound and you got to cover it. Oh, okay, yeah, that makes sense. I've never heard of a ream. What do you call a stack of papers? Stack of papers. He would have just looked over and said, "Can we kick that guy out? That'd be great." I love Dr. Yasir. He's great. All right. So we're going to end this here. That's part 1. We'll be back for part 2 tomorrow. For you. For me, it'll be in about 15 minutes. So until next time, have a good day. Have a good night.